Hi, David. It's so nice to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
Elisha, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Beautiful. And like I mentioned earlier, thank you so very much for being here. I truly appreciate it. And you see, now I'm about to recite my anthem. And I use the word anthem because I say these words often to all of my guests. So, firstly, David, I want to thank you for investing in yourself. You see, you are on this platform right now because you invested in yourself. And oftentimes, David, I love to make reference to the amazing mango tree. You see, some months back, I was on a particular road, and just by the roadside, there was this tall, unattractive mango tree. And I use the word unattractive because the mango tree's got no mangoes on it, and the leaves were all dry. I just walked past it. But you see, just recently, David, I was on that same road, and this time around, a lot's changed about the tree. The mango tree caught my attention pretty good from a distance, and immediately I got the urge to move so close to it to have a good look, of which I did, and it wowed me. You see, now the mango tree's got a lot of mangoes on it, beautiful green leaves and healthy branches. And you see, not just mangoes, but ripe mangoes. It was beautiful. I was so excited that very day. You see, now my point is, the fact that you dedicated your time, energy, and resources to becoming the amazing person that you are today, that alone has made it impossible for me to skip you. And that's why you see you got the request from me to be on the
Thank
show.
you.
Yeah, because I was attracted to the fruit of all that you're doing, your philosophies, your insights, your work. It is amazing. And thank you for so very much for being here. And secondly, thank you for saying yes to the invite, David. Because if you had said nope, there was nothing I could do about it. Thank you so very much, man.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. I love what you're doing. So thank you for having me.
Thank you too. So let's get started. You say, David, I am quite excited to have you on the show today for some reasons. Firstly, my interest in knowledge seeking. I believe in order for one to transition from a terrible situation to that of a beautiful one, David, I believe it takes the application of knowledge. And not just knowledge, but the application of it. And you see, ever since I discovered that light in the Hebrew means knowledge and darkness means ignorance, I've been so keen to knowledge seeking because I do not want to remain in the dark. So that's going to make our conversation today very, very, very important to me and even to the listeners. The second reason why I'm excited to have the amazing David on the show is for the sake of the listeners. You see, David, we live in an age where information is as abundant as grains of sand. We've got lots of information flying out there. So these folks trust me for quality, eye-opening, and powerful information, of which I am totally convinced that our conversation is going to be insightful and impactful. So for that reason, David, let's get started with your introduction. Talk to us about your personal or professional journey. We are just so curious right now. We want to know how David got here. Then afterwards, I've got some beautiful questions for you. Okay, David, over to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. What a wonderful introduction. So my story is I grew up in the military. My father was a United States Marine Corps officer, and I spent most of my childhood growing up on military bases, which is a very unique way to grow up. It's a very insulated environment. It's almost like a universe unto itself. The beauty of it was we got to spend time overseas. So as a boy, when I was in fifth grade, we moved to Okinawa, Japan. So I spent 3 years in Japan, which was incredible. We got to go to the Philippines, we got to go to see South Korea, and being exposed to different cultures at such a young age had a huge impression on me. This was ancient history back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth back in the 70s, and you just didn't have that opportunity as middle income or lesser, lower middle income family. So I came back to the States and no one really had that same experience. And I was kind of like, okay, well, that's all right. So I'm a little bit different now. Went to college to major in English, but I also knew because I didn't know how to navigate the real world, I was going to become a Marine Corps officer and follow in the footsteps of my brother and father. And I did that for 15 years. I did a combat tour in Somalia as part of the initial landing force back in 1992. And probably about 10 or 11 years into my career, I just became disillusioned. I've been married and divorced. And I just kind of realized there has to be more than life. Like, I don't want to I had this mindset that my dad's life blueprint was going to be mine. And so he had done 31 years in the military, and I was going to do the same thing. And I decided at 15 years to get out and try to carve my own path. So I got out, went to work at Cisco Systems, the giant IT company, became a yoga instructor. That wasn't part of my plan ever, but yoga just called to me to kind of go on the internal journey, which is something that my traditional conventional faith really hadn't afforded me. Married again, divorced again, going into the last probably 10 years or so, was still just looking. And part of my life's journey had been somehow this idea that a woman was going to connect me to God. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know how I'd recognize her or how I'd find her. But that was just what I believed. And it had taken me through a couple of marriages and divorces, no relationships that could work. And I was coming out of a relationship in October of 2019 and was just some ways so downtrodden because I tried everything. I tried looking for different partners. I tried just different, people with different interests, people who were similar to me, people who were different, everything, and nothing seemed to work. At the same time, in 2017, I wrote my first book about finding your purpose in life. And that was such a pivotal year for me. I became a life coach that year. I went to 2 Tony Robbins events and started to realize that there is an architecture to the soul, if you will, and that it's important for us to navigate and create that from within us. It's not something that we can get from social media, from being liked or followed. It's an internal journey. And even I was ending this 3.5-year relationship right before the pandemic started, I had this just wild sense of optimism because I was kind of like, by addressing my inner workings and holding myself to a higher standard, there was a sense of clarity coming into my life. And as the pandemic started, I was working on my 3rd book. I had a couple extraordinary experiences I would call miraculous experiences during the first 2.5 months of the pandemic. And then I got into the summer of 2020 and I realized I cognitively understood the story of Jesus. I did not emotionally and physically have the conviction that it was true. And I say that because it was, in some ways, the pandemic to me seemed like it made sense. Like, here I'm having this horrible life experience after spending my entire life looking for someone. And part of that was, one of those was the miracle, or one of those was the spectacular experience that early in the pandemic, in April, I was working on my book in my bedroom. I was journaling it, and I stopped and I opened up Instagram, and there was this picture of this woman. I had just started following her like 2 months before, but she was wearing a black dress standing in a field of golden wheat. And I was just blown away. I mean, it was like just this breathtakingly beautiful picture. And it was more not, I mean, she's physically beautiful, but it was just an indication of how she saw herself. Like that she saw herself in this way to do this really regal and elegant picture. And instantly I knew I'd somewhere seen this picture before. And I was like, I'm going to write my next book about this picture. And it inspired me so much. And that led me to the summer of not having the conviction in my physiology, the absolute certainty of Christ's triumph over death. And so for the next really 1.5 years, I struggled with my faith. I struggled with learning. I was throwing myself into all kinds of books. It was kind of such a hard experience for me. Friends of mine offered to let me come live with them while I was undergoing all this. And I had some more miraculous experiences with people. And I just, after, I had the book idea in October 2019, and I finally came up with a title for it in November of 2021. And it was this idea that King David, if you read the Bible, it doesn't ascend to heaven. It's in Acts, the book of Acts. He doesn't ascend to heaven. And there's a covenant made between him that puts responsibility that he'll have a dynasty of kings and then an everlasting kingdom and an eternal throne that Jesus is responsible for creating. And so as I started to put all this together, I thought, well, what would hell be like for King David if he doesn't ascend to heaven? And he's turned his house against him by sleeping with Bathsheba and all these other things. And I kind of realized that's what I was writing about. That's what I was writing about, that this woman, this image on Instagram was so profound and it moved me so deeply. And it led me to write my next book, which was Love Letters to the Virgin Mary, The Resurrection of King David. And it was this idea that instead of projecting God outside of us, as we're so often want to do, God is inside. And I've been reading, to kind of tie this off, I've been reading Dr. Jordan Peterson's latest book, We Who Wrestle with God, which is such a profound and deep book. And in the early chapters, he talks about the story of Elijah, the prophet. And he said the big takeaway from Elijah is that God is not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire. God is in the internal voice of our conscience. And it's through that realization that there's a dialogue that takes place within us. And whatever you set your aim to, whatever your goal is, you're going to be answered by the spirits of that goal. And the idea is if you set your aim on the highest good, which is Christ, then that's what you'll get answered. And it's really been profound. So I spent the last really 5 years working tremendously on fortifying my internal faith and resilience that Christ is King and just his triumph and really what it means that he is the Alpha and the Omega. And kind of to tie it off, I just posted on Instagram and on LinkedIn earlier or over the weekend was if you see the cover to Love Letters to the Virgin Mary, it's got Thor's hammer on it. And people are like, what does that have to do with the Bible story? And there's a history to it. And it's wild because I had one of the experiences I had during the pandemic was kind of a Ragnarok moment. If you're familiar with Marvel movies and Ragnarok, Norse mythology is the doom of gods and men. And Thor's partly implicated in that. And so I had this experience and I watched the first Thor movie and there's actually a reference to King David. There's a book on a bookshelf that says King David the King. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And then I started to go dig deeper. And I realized that Jesus and Thor have a history in Germania when the Romans were trying to conquer the Germanic tribes. And there's jewelry molds they found that have a hammer for Thor's hammer and a cross for Jesus' cross, because jewelers at the time didn't know which god their customer was going to prefer. So it was kind of cool because it's this opening idea that the highest good in any of us must be the highest good in all of us. And the idea is, if Jesus is the light of the world, then what does it take for us to see that light universally, not conditionally based on what someone else believes, but for us to have the conviction that even if this person has a different belief structure than I do, I still believe they are part of God's kingdom and there is a divine entity or representation in them. So I hope that answers your question.
Amazing, David. You see, that's a very interesting one. And the part that touched me really hard was when you step into this self-awareness. You didn't want to follow the blueprint, and you went after what you wanted to become. Boy, to some, that's a very hard thing to do. I tell you, man. You see, because I had to struggle with that. Not
Sure.
not that I wasn't willing to. Okay, my upbringing. All right, my dad wanted me to take the step he took, and he wanted me to follow the same path that he did,
Mm-hmm.
of which I fought it. But you see, just like how your heart is so deep in love for the Lord, of which I can tell, it's amazing. I love Jesus so much, and he found me at a very young age. Okay, so the age when he found me was that age where I was still dependent on my parents. All right, I was a teenager now.
Mm.
Yeah, I relied on them for everything. So now he wanted me to be a Muslim because he is a Muslim, and he wanted me to go that same path. As a matter of fact, his desire was that I become one of imams and all of these spiritual leaders in the Islamic sector of religion. And at that young age, I had to fight that. It was
Mm.
so tough and difficult, but Jesus helped me. And now, my dad now would sit down and listen to me teach him about Jesus willingly. I tell you,
Wow.
willingly. I tell you. So when you were talking about that stuff, I said, oh man, I can relate to this because, boy, that's a great one. So there is this part that you talked about that caught my attention about David. Okay, I want you to talk to us more about that. Maybe the research that you did or the revelations that the Holy Spirit showed unto you. I want you to feed
Yeah.
us more on that.
For sure, for sure. Well, and a lot of it I didn't know when I wrote Love Letters to the Virgin Mary. And part of it was the psychology. I was dealing with such a heavy psychology trying to go through this and trying to process. And it was, in one sense, it was me trying to fortify my faith. In another sense, it was me trying to bring that faith to life, like to see Christ everywhere. not just to see Christ in this, like a part of it was for me, this picture of this woman was the first light of Christ for me. Like it was that distinct. It was this signature that I could tune into. And over the last few years, I was like, well, I want to see that light everywhere. And I think I'm absolutely positive that's what Jesus was too, to see that light universally, not conditionally in people who believe what I believe or who go to the same church or anything like that. And that was a journey too. So I left my corporate job in early 2023, and I just published Love Letters at the end of December of 2022. And I thought, well, how do I really own my relationship with Christ? And I thought, well, let me write a sequel. I'll write a sequel called Love Letters to Jesus. And it talks more about, it gets really psychological because it was like, I want to look at the archetypes that Carl Jung, the psychologist, put together. There's different archetypes that we have, and we have to integrate those archetypes. And I started to do that through the book. And then I'd been working with a Tony Robbins coach by that point, a year and a half. I was making progress, but even my coach was like, this doesn't feel right. And I kind of thought, okay, well, I got to the summer of last year. It was kind of a year process of going through all this. I got to the summer of last year and I said, what is the greatest test of faith? And I said, the greatest test of faith is, has Christ triumphed over death or not? Like that's not, at some point we have to consciously be able to acknowledge that. And so in September of 2023, to lead into this past year, I looked into the Bible story in depth and I said, what does David's story say? People know him as a Goliath killer, and he was Israel's second king, and he was great. There's got to be more to it. And there's a covenant that God makes to David. And it's, you have an everlasting kingdom, eternal throne, and your offspring is going to create this for you. And David's like, oh, this is amazing. This story's in 2 Samuel. It's like, oh, this is amazing. You're making this promise to a human. Thank you, Lord. This is incredible. And then he breaks it because he sleeps with Bathsheba and has her husband Uriah killed in battle. And the prophet Nathan is the one who calls him out and says, the Lord says, you have turned your house against you. Well, now, wait a minute. If David has turned his house against him and the ultimate throne of his house is Jesus, that is a pretty big division that David has created. And when you look at the implications of what he writes about in the Psalms, now it takes on a much darker tone, because as we find out, I think it's in the book of Mark or Matthew, a house divided cannot stand. So David's house cannot stand. And as I went to research, it wasn't just about looking in Christianity, it was looking in Islam, and it was looking in Judaism, because all three believe in a Messiah. And Islam and Christianity believe that Messiah is Jesus. Islam believes that Jesus is the Messiah to the Jewish people. And I'm not even sure Christians believe that necessarily, because they just think of him as the Messiah, but without that frame of reference. Well, what do the Jews believe? Well, Jews believe the Messiah comes from the house of David. That's the dynasty of kings. So then when you start to look into the Psalms, what you find is David is the one who prophesies death by crucifixion for Jesus. And he does it in the first person. He doesn't say his hands and feet are pierced. He says they pierce my hands and my feet. And then he also prophesies betrayal by Judas. And this is, the crucifixion prophecy is 300 or 400 years, or I think actually maybe even 600 years before the Romans invent crucifixion as a form of torture. So think about, he's getting this download of this is what's going to happen to the Messiah. And there's also some really eerie and cryptic things that David writes in the Psalms. One of those things is he says, I am greatly afflicted. Another one he says is, I am cut off from your sight, meaning the sight of God. And probably most compellingly, he says, everyone is a liar. So by saying everyone is a liar, and part of this too is when you read through when David becomes king, he is possessed by the Spirit of the Lord. And it's the Lord in all caps, L-O-R-D, all caps. So he's got a pretty big possession going on. And then he breaks this covenant that God has made to him. So everyone is a liar. Well, that's pretty heavy stuff. What's really interesting then is you take it into the New Testament. Part of the impetus that prompted me to write Love Letters to the Virgin Mary was there is one Bible verse that brings Mary, Jesus, and David together. And I want to say it's Luke 1:32. And it's when the archangel Gabriel tells Mary that, hey, you're going to give birth to the Messiah, to Jesus. And he's going to be given the throne of his father, David. Then in the New Testament, there are 18 references to Jesus being the son of David. What's most fascinating, though, is there are 3 separate places where the same verse is repeated. The most compelling one is in Acts 2:34. And that's when the author Luke says, "For David did not ascend to heaven, and yet he said, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand while I make your enemies a footstool for your feet.'" Why is this fascinating? At one point, Jesus is talking with the Pharisees, and he says, "Who do you think the Messiah, what about the Messiah? Whose son do you think he is?" And they say, "The son of David." And Jesus says, "Well, how can he be the son of David if David says, in speaking through the Spirit of the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand while I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." If David calls the Messiah my Lord, how can the Messiah be his son? And the Pharisees can't answer him. You get to the book of Revelations, the last page of the book of Revelation, and Jesus says, "I am the root and the offspring of David," meaning I am David's beginning and I am David's end. And so it's this idea that the path for human salvation is how does David come to accept Jesus as both his root and offspring? And if that's the path that David must take, isn't that the path we all have to take to really embrace Jesus on the level that he terms? And that's really the Alpha and the Omega. So it's been an intensive study. My next book is actually going to focus on that much more deeply, because Love Letters to the Virgin Mary was much more emotional in terms of the excitement of seeing this beautiful woman. My next book is called Becoming One with Christ, The Lessons of King David, and it speaks to what Jesus says about how he is one with the Father and no one comes to the Father except through him. Well, then what does that mean? It means, I believe, we must become one with Christ in order to access the Father.
That's right. We must become one with Christ in order to access the Father. Very correct and very true. That's a brilliant one. Okay, David, to bring this to an end, what would you like to leave the audience with, like a final thought? And to those folks who would like to reach out to you, learn more about everything we've discussed so far, or even ask you questions, how can that be possible?
Absolutely. Well, first, let me say thank you again so much for having me on. This has been for a short period of time, it's been so impactful, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. The thing that I would leave with your audience is stop looking outside of you for salvation. Salvation's inside of you. We all share the mind of Christ. That's in the book of Galatians. And once you start to realize that you get to wake up that consciousness within you, you'll start to see it everywhere. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So find that inner voice. Tune into that inner voice and realize the greatness lives within you. And as you awaken to it, you'll see it in other people. If you want to reach out to me, I'm on davidrichards.com, davidrichardsauthor.com. So you can reach me there at my website. I'm online on Instagram, David Richards Author as well.
Beautiful. So that's going to be the end of the show, David. Thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing this beautiful stuff with us. It means a whole lot, man. Thank you.
Thank you. Blessings.